Over 200 black communities in the United States didn't disappear by accident. They weren't lost to time, nor erased by natural disaster. They were deliberately wiped from the map, hidden beneath calm lakes and man-made reservoirs, all under a single, powerful word: progress. Imagine standing at the edge of a peaceful body of water. The surface is still. Families picnic nearby. Boats drift slowly across the horizon. Nothing about this place feels tragic until you learn what lies beneath. Beneath the water are streets where children once played, churches where families gathered, schools where futures were shaped, and businesses built through determination and sacrifice. Entire towns, full of life and promise, now rest in silence. After the Civil War, Black Americans who had survived generations of bondage did something extraordinary. They built their own communities. They created towns where land ownership meant security, where education meant freedom, and where hard work could finally lead to opportunity. These places stood as proof of resilience, and that proof made powerful people uncomfortable. As America expanded, large infrastructure projects were introduced as symbols of national improvement. Dams, lakes, and reservoirs promised electricity, water, and flood control. But for hundreds of black communities, these projects meant displacement, loss, and erasure. Families were forced to leave their land. Histories were buried, and over time, their stories faded from public memory. This is not just a story about water. It's a story about power, about whose progress was protected and whose was sacrificed. In this video, we're bringing those forgotten communities back into the light. We're uncovering the truth hidden beneath America's waters and exploring a history rarely taught or discussed. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us because what you're about to hear will change the way you see progress forever. After the Civil War, freedom arrived on paper, but the reality that followed was far more complicated. For formerly enslaved Black Americans, liberation did not come with land, protection, or equal opportunity. Instead, it came with uncertainty, hostility, and a nation still unwilling to accept their humanity. Yet in the midst of those conditions, something remarkable began to take shape. Across the United States, black families chose not only to survive, but to build. They pooled resources, shared skills, and transformed open land into self-sufficient towns that became symbols of stability, ambition, and collective strength. These communities were not temporary settlements or isolated villages. They were carefully structured towns with schools that prioritized education as a pathway to freedom, churches that served as spiritual and social anchors, and businesses that kept money circulating within the community. Black-owned banks offered loans when no one else would, allowing families to buy land, open shops, and invest in their children's futures. Farmers cultivated their own crops. Tradespeople mastered their crafts, and teachers passed knowledge to the next generation with the understanding that education was both a shield and a key. What made these towns extraordinary was not just their existence, but what they represented. In a society that had long denied black competence and independence, these communities quietly dismantled those false narratives. They proved that, given even limited opportunity, Black Americans could create economic systems, maintain civic order, and thrive through cooperation and discipline. Prosperity did not come overnight, and it was rarely easy, but it was real. Homes were built, businesses expanded, and a sense of pride took root in places where despair was expected to remain. This progress did not go unnoticed. As these towns grew stronger, they stood in sharp contrast to the myths used to justify inequality. Their success challenged long-standing beliefs about who deserved land, wealth, and influence. What began as self-determination soon became viewed as defiance. The same resilience that allowed these communities to flourish also made them visible, and visibility brought scrutiny. Envy and resentment followed closely behind, fueled by the uncomfortable reality that these towns were succeeding despite every obstacle placed in their path. Still, life continued. Children walked to school each morning, shop owners greeted familiar faces, and families gathered on Sundays in churches built with their own hands. These towns offered something rare in that era: safety, belonging, and a future shaped by choice rather than fear. They were living proof that freedom, when paired with unity, could produce something lasting. For many residents, this was the first time in their lives that ownership and dignity felt secure. But as America moved forward, the definition of progress began to shift, and not everyone was included in its promise. Large-scale development plans emerged, framed as necessary steps toward modernization and national growth. On paper, these projects seemed neutral, even beneficial. In practice, they often targeted the very communities that had worked the hardest to establish themselves. The towns built by formerly enslaved people, once symbols of renewal after centuries of bondage, suddenly stood in the path of expansion. The story of these self-sufficient black towns is essential to understanding what came next. Their rise explains why their destruction mattered. They were not empty spaces waiting to be used, but living communities with histories, economies, and dreams firmly rooted in the land. When they were later erased, it was not only buildings that disappeared, but evidence of what black Americans had achieved against all odds. Their foundations still exist, even if they now rest beneath water, reminding us that progress has always depended on whose lives are considered worth preserving. The success of these black towns did not exist in isolation, nor did it unfold quietly in the background of American history. As these communities grew stronger, more organized, and more prosperous, they began to draw attention from the surrounding world. What had once been dismissed as temporary or insignificant was now impossible to ignore. Businesses were thriving, land was being owned and passed down, and institutions built by black hands were functioning with discipline and purpose. For many observers, especially those who had been taught to believe that such success was impossible, this progress created deep discomfort. That discomfort soon transformed into resentment. The presence of independent black towns challenged long-standing social hierarchies and exposed the fragility of beliefs that had justified exclusion for generations. These communities were not asking for permission, nor were they waiting for acceptance. They were building their own futures, and in doing so, they disrupted a system that relied on control and limitation. Prosperity in these towns became misrepresented as arrogance, and self-sufficiency was reframed as a threat. The response was rarely subtle. In some places, intimidation became a daily reality. In others, it escalated into organized destruction, as entire towns were attacked, businesses ruined, and families forced to flee. These acts were not spontaneous reactions, but the result of growing hostility toward black advancement. Violence became one of the first tools used to dismantle what had been built, sending a clear message that success alone offered no protection. Alongside this hostility, laws and policies emerged that gave discrimination a formal structure. Jim Crow regulations tightened their grip, limiting where black Americans could live, work, and travel. These laws did more than enforce separation. They systematically restricted access to resources that allowed communities to grow. Opportunities to expand businesses, secure fair loans, or protect property became increasingly scarce. Legal barriers replaced open confrontation, making inequality appear orderly and justified. What made this period especially devastating was how closely these policies aligned with moments of black progress. Whenever communities found ways to adapt and push forward, new restrictions followed. Advancement was met with resistance at every turn, as if success itself had become the offense. Even within their own towns, black families were forced to operate under constant pressure, aware that stability could be challenged at any moment. This environment of fear and restriction weakened the defenses of even the strongest communities. Towns that had survived economic hardship now faced political and legal obstacles designed to wear them down slowly. Land ownership became precarious, legal disputes increased, and the cost of maintaining independence rose sharply. The sense of security that once defined these towns began to erode, not because of failure from within, but because of sustained pressure from outside forces. As resentment hardened into policy, the groundwork was laid for more sweeping forms of removal. The idea that black towns were expendable became easier to justify once their progress had been framed as undesirable. Development plans, infrastructure proposals, and government interventions would later draw upon this same mindset, presenting displacement as necessary and unavoidable. By the time those projects arrived, many communities had already been weakened by years of legal exclusion and social hostility. Understanding this stage of the story is essential because it explains how erasure became possible. The destruction of black towns was not a sudden event, but the final chapter in a longer process of resistance to black independence. Their success revealed what was possible, and that possibility was precisely what some sought to eliminate. What followed was not simply the loss of towns, but the silencing of a future that had once seemed within reach. As open hostility and restrictive laws tightened their grip on black communities, a quieter and far more effective tool emerged, one that carried the authority of legality and the appearance of neutrality. Eminent domain, a principle originally intended to serve the public good, became a mechanism through which removal could be carried out with official approval. On paper, it promised fairness and compensation. In reality, it was often applied unevenly, and black families were the ones who paid the highest price. By this point, many black towns had already endured years of pressure. Legal barriers limited growth, intimidation disrupted stability, and prosperity was constantly framed as a problem rather than an achievement. When government officials arrived with surveys and plans for dams, reservoirs, and large infrastructure projects, these communities were rarely given meaningful choices. Notices were brief, explanations were vague, and resistance was discouraged through bureaucratic complexity rather than open confrontation. What had once been built with patience and cooperation was suddenly deemed replaceable. Land that had been cultivated for generations was reclassified as necessary for development. Homes that represented safety and progress were reduced to numbers on official documents. Compensation, when offered at all, was often far below the true value of the property, ignoring not only economic worth but also cultural and historical significance. For many families, the payments were insufficient to purchase new land elsewhere, especially in areas where discriminatory practices already restricted housing options. Starting over was not a transition, it was a forced reset. The contrast with how white communities were treated was impossible to miss. In many cases, white landowners received better notice, stronger legal protections, and higher compensation. Entire neighborhoods were rerouted around when objections were raised, while black towns were labeled expendable. Decisions were framed as technical necessities rather than moral choices, allowing unequal outcomes to be justified without acknowledgement. The language of progress masked the reality of displacement. What made this process particularly devastating was its finality. Unlike earlier waves of pressure that communities could adapt to, eminent domain left little room for recovery. Once land was seized and flooding began, there was no return. Buildings were dismantled, cemeteries relocated or forgotten, and roads erased from maps. As water rose, so did silence. The physical traces of these towns disappeared, making it easier for their stories to fade from public memory. For families who had once believed land ownership offered permanence, the loss cut deeply. Ownership had symbolized security in a country where so little had ever been guaranteed. It was a promise that hard work could lead to stability, that progress could be inherited rather than constantly rebuilt. When that land was taken, it was not just property that vanished, but the foundation for generational continuity. Children grew up without access to what their parents had built, and histories that might have been passed down through place were reduced to memory alone. This pattern repeated itself across the country. Each project was presented as isolated, each displacement framed as unfortunate but necessary. Yet together, they formed a clear trajectory. Black advancement was tolerated only so long as it remained fragile. When it became rooted and visible, it was removed through systems designed to appear impartial. Eminent domain did not introduce inequality. It formalized it, transforming social resentment into administrative action. Understanding this moment in the story reveals how erasure can occur without spectacle. There were no headlines announcing the end of these towns, no national reckoning as families were uprooted. The process unfolded through paperwork, hearings, and construction schedules, quietly accomplishing what violence and exclusion had begun. By the time the water settled and lakes reflected the sky, the communities beneath them had already been written out of the present. This chapter connects directly to what followed, because once land was gone, so too was the ability to reclaim what had been lost. The removal of black families through eminent domain was not an accidental consequence of development, but a decisive step in dismantling independence. It ensured that progress would move forward, but only for some, while others were left watching their foundations disappear beneath the surface. As the land was taken and the water began to rise, a larger pattern came into focus, one that connected these individual losses into a single, unsettling truth. What had happened to these black towns was not random, and it was not evenly shared. The same forces that once tolerated inequality now reshaped the environment itself, deciding whose communities could be sacrificed and whose would be preserved. This was one of the earliest expressions of what we now understand as environmental racism, a system where harm was distributed along racial lines while responsibility remained obscured. The logic was always presented as practical. Dams needed valleys, reservoirs needed space, and progress required difficult decisions. Yet those decisions consistently pointed in the same direction. Black neighborhoods, often described as underdeveloped or less valuable, were marked as suitable for removal, while nearby white communities were more likely to be spared, rerouted around, or compensated with care. The land beneath black towns was treated as empty long before the water arrived, as if the lives rooted there carried less weight. This pattern did not emerge overnight. It followed decades of policies that had already pushed black communities into more vulnerable positions. Segregation limited where families could live, discriminatory lending restricted expansion, and legal barriers narrowed opportunities for protection. By the time environmental decisions were made, these towns had fewer defenses, fewer allies, and less access to influence. That vulnerability became justification. Their removal was framed as unfortunate but acceptable, a trade-off for the greater good. What made this form of displacement especially insidious was how quietly it unfolded. There were no dramatic announcements acknowledging loss, no public mourning for what was being erased. Maps were redrawn, property lines dissolved, and construction moved forward. When reservoirs filled and lakes formed, the narrative shifted entirely. These places became destinations, symbols of recreation and natural beauty, while the communities beneath them vanished from collective awareness. The environment itself became a cover, hiding the evidence of what had been taken. For those who were displaced, the impact lingered far beyond relocation. The loss of land disrupted social networks that had taken generations to build. Churches that once anchored communities no longer had a physical home. Schools that nurtured ambition disappeared, scattering students into unfamiliar systems. Even burial grounds were disturbed, severing the physical connection between ancestors and descendants. The landscape changed, but the sense of absence remained. Environmental racism did not end with the flooding of these towns. It established a precedent. Once it became acceptable to sacrifice black communities for development, similar logic appeared elsewhere. Industrial zones were placed closer to black neighborhoods, highways cut through historic districts, and waste facilities were located where resistance was least likely to succeed. The same reasoning repeated itself. Some spaces were deemed disposable, and some lives were expected to adapt to loss. What ties this chapter to the earlier story of black self-sufficiency is the contrast it reveals. These towns were not struggling settlements incapable of sustaining themselves. They were organized, productive, and rooted in cooperation. Their destruction was not the result of failure, but of success that conflicted with an unequal vision of progress. Environmental decisions became another way to manage that conflict, using geography and development as instruments of control. Understanding this history reshapes how we view the landscape today. Lakes that appear peaceful, valleys that seem untouched, and infrastructure that promises benefit often carry hidden stories beneath their surfaces. Environmental racism did not require overt hostility to operate. It relied on planning meetings, zoning maps, and legal authority, quietly determining whose homes could be erased without consequence. This part of the story matters because it shows how injustice can be embedded into systems that appear neutral. The flooding of black towns was not simply a series of unfortunate outcomes tied to growth. It was a pattern shaped by unequal power, one that reshaped both land and lives. By recognizing these actions as environmental racism, we begin to see that the harm was not accidental, and that progress, when defined without equity, has always carried a cost that some were forced to bear more than others. The consequences of these actions did not end when the water finally settled and the construction crews moved on. What was lost went far beyond buildings and land. For the families who were displaced, the destruction of their towns marked the beginning of a long chain of losses that continues to shape lives today. Generational wealth, cultural heritage, service and a sense of continuity were stripped away, leaving wounds that could not be repaired by relocation or time alone. For many American families, land ownership has long been the foundation of stability. It provides security, access to opportunity, and something tangible to pass down. In these Black communities, land was not only owned, but carefully cultivated and protected as a promise to future generations. When that land was taken, the promise was broken. Families were forced to start over with limited resources, often in places where opportunity was restricted and ownership was difficult to reclaim. The wealth that could have grown over decades was erased in a single decision, widening a gap that has never fully closed. The loss of cultural heritage was just as profound. These towns were living archives of shared experience, shaped by tradition, faith, and collective memory. Churches held stories of endurance, schools carried the hopes of progress, and neighborhoods preserved a sense of belonging that could not be replicated elsewhere. When these spaces disappeared, so did the physical connections to that history. What remained were stories passed down through generations, fragments of a world that once existed but no longer had a place on the map. The emotional impact of this loss continues to ripple outward. Descendants of displaced families often grow up hearing about towns that no longer exist, about homes that sit beneath water, and about opportunities that were taken without consent. This inherited trauma is difficult to measure, but its presence is undeniable. It shapes identity, trust, and the way people relate to institutions that once promised fairness. The absence of recognition only deepens the pain, reinforcing the sense that these losses were meant to be forgotten. Today's racial wealth gap cannot be understood without acknowledging this history. Inequality did not appear overnight, nor is it the result of individual failure. It was built through repeated acts of removal, exclusion, and denial of opportunity. When entire communities were erased, the economic and social momentum they had created was halted, leaving lasting consequences that echo across generations. What was taken was not only wealth, but time and chance for progress to compound and endure. Yet remembering these stories offers a path forward. Recognition does not undo the damage, but it restores dignity to those who were erased. It allows history to be seen more clearly and challenges the idea that progress is neutral or inevitable. By understanding what was lost, we begin to question how progress is defined and who is asked to pay its price. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect on this history. These stories matter because they reveal truths that still shape the present. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard and remembered, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that stories buried beneath the surface are finally brought back into the light.